In 1992, we saw General Dostum switch sides and join the Mujahideen warlords to allow them to capture the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul. So the Najibullah government collapsed, following which there were 4 years of civil war as these 7 different warlords, including Dostum, fought each other for control of Kabul. Now, they nominally elected a president, Barnuddin Rabbani, but there was no government effectively. There was rape, pillage. Indeed, the only ministry that this government had was war, the Ministry of War. Nothing else happened in Afghanistan, and particularly in Kabul. During this time, the city was leveled. There were massive casualties of civilians. Indeed, Kabul became depopulated to some extent. It was a very dangerous place. It was a war zone. Indeed, it's some indication of the insecurity in Kabul at this time that the burqa, which everybody will be familiar with as, being synonymous with, Afghan women, a form of dress that completely covers and enshrouds the body, had previously only existed in the countryside. This was a very traditional form of dress, and people in Kabul had, generally been quite modern and westernized. But the burqa came into fashion for everybody, for all women, because it was seen as the only guarantee that women had against being raped, because it enshrouded the body. It was unlikely to allow attractive women to be identified and raped. So I'm digressing, but you get the picture, I think, that the very people, these warlords that the West had funded and organized and sent in to Afghanistan to overthrow a progressive, westernized, secular regime, the kind of regime that we now talk about supporting, we actually overthrew, and we replaced them with these brigands, these mercenaries who had no aims whatsoever except enriching themselves and inflicting suffering on the people. Now, it is in this background, in this context, that the Taliban developed. Now, the Taliban, it was an exclusively Pashtun organization. It was drawn from Pashtun refugees in Pakistan who'd been educated in the madrasas, which had been set up there for them with Saudi Arabian and Gulf state funding to convert these people to a very fundamentalist and conservative type of Islam, what is called Wahhabism, which is basically a back to basics version of Islam, trying to get back to what Islam had originally been in the 6th, 7th century when it was developed. So out of this context, from the scholars in the madrasas, the Taliban developed. Indeed, the very word talib is a student. So the Taliban were the students. That's what Taliban stands for. And their aims were actually laudable, that they wanted to restore some civil order to Afghanistan society and to replace this absence of any law and order, this anarchy of the warlords, with a society that was civil society that was based on the precepts of Islam, that was based on the fundamentals of the Quran. And so this new movement, the Taliban, was very popular. People welcomed the Taliban and supported them as a hope for some kind of stability in place of the anarchy and mayhem that had been brought by the rule of the warlords, or lack of rule. So, as ostensibly, the Taliban were a reform movement, and they were indeed a progressive reform movement in the context of their time. And I think this is something that we've always failed to recognize. Much of the later anti-Taliban rhetoric that we were subjected to after 9/11 really focused on the cultural, the excesses of the Taliban, but never really put these in the context of the previous excesses of the warlords and their criminality. So when the Taliban eventually captured Kabul and established control over the Afghanistan hinterlands, they then continued to push the Northern Alliance back. And at this time, the Western powers, who'd actually previously taken an interest in Afghanistan and funded these warlords, the Mujahideen, now really abandoned Afghanistan. They abandoned it to its own destiny. They had no interest. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the Cold War was over, and nobody had any interest in Afghanistan. As far as they were concerned, there were no longer any strategic interests in Afghanistan. So generally, we ceased to support and arm Dostum and his allies, like Massoud, the leader of the what was now the Northern Alliance. They retreated to the northern provinces of Afghanistan, where they continued to harry the Taliban military and their civil organizations. At this time, the Northern Alliance was very internationally isolated, poorly armed, and they were unable to hold their territory from Taliban control for any length of time. Indeed, when the US decided that it had further interest in Afghanistan, they did actually meet with the Taliban government, although they didn't recognize the Taliban government. They operated with proxies, the Saudi Arabians and the Pakistanis, to try to negotiate about their vested interests. Now, one of the US strategic interests that developed was a plan for a large pipeline to go from the Caspian Sea to bring gas, natural gas, from the areas around the Caspian Sea across Afghanistan, and then the part of Pakistan called Baluchistan, and to bring that to the Indian Ocean, where they could actually then take that gas off in ships and export it. So the US acted through their proxies to negotiate a deal to take this pipeline through Afghanistan territory. And everything seemed fine. There was at that time, no strategic reason for the US to be further involved in Afghanistan. However, then the Taliban made two decisions which were to prove disastrous. They had been also approached by the Chinese about putting in a different pipeline. The Chinese had a different plan to pipe in gas through Afghanistan's territory, and indeed the Taliban were warmer to actually doing a deal with China as an Asian country than they were to working with the US multinationals, and therefore they revoked the deal that they made over the Kanoko pipeline from the Caspian. And the second decision that also affected US interest was that they agreed to end the opium trade. Now, everybody would think that ending the opium trade was something that the US would actually applaud, and that the West would actually applaud, because by that time the US had already started its own war on drugs, and we were signed up to enforcing the UN conventions against drugs, against the opium and heroin trade, which had actually been established under the warlords, under these Northern Alliance warlords, Hekmat Shagul, Budin, Ahmad Massoud, and indeed Dostum himself. All these people, and including Karzai, his brother, they were all involved in the opium production and the heroin trade. So one would have expected that we would have supported the Taliban in ending the opium trade and the production of opium and heroin in Afghanistan. But in fact, the intelligence agencies, various interests in the US, including the financial institutions, had a vested interest in keeping the drug trade flowing, in keeping the heroin trade going. It was a part of their black operations in Asia, just like they had created the Golden Triangle in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Now they had also fostered the production of heroin in Afghanistan under the Northern Alliance Warlords. When 9/11 happened, the Taliban did not really know what to do. They even offered to give up bin Laden, but this was never going to be enough. The plans for the invasion of Afghanistan had already been, long in the planning, and there was no way that the US was not going to invade Afghanistan. Indeed, their ultimatum to Afghanistan was that they demanded that the Taliban effectively capitulate and allow US forces to occupy their territory in order to ostensibly fight Al-Qaeda. So the plan to invade was on the cards. Now, an interesting event occurred days before 9/11. On September the 9th, there was the assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud. Now, Ahmad Shah Massoud, also called the Lion of Panjshir, he was then the nominal head of the Tajik-led Northern Alliance. So Dostum was one of his subordinates, and he was assassinated by a press TV company, a spoof TV company asked to do an interview with him, and when they did the interview, the cameras were actually bombs, and he was blown up. So that took Massoud out of the picture. And I would speculate that the assassination of Massoud, although it was blamed on the Taliban and then later on Al-Qaeda, was actually in the interests of the US. I think always when one looks at these events, you have to look at who benefits, cui bono. Okay, so recapping, the elimination of Massoud actually provided Rashid Dostum with the opportunity to become the US partner in the invasion of Afghanistan as the leader of the Northern Alliance, who were the ground troops in the US assault on the Taliban forces.